I remember constantly sort of recognizing that I was telling myself quite loudly in my head that my brain was really full, that I needed rest. You have to give yourself permission to place value on think time. And if you're measures driven, put some sort of a system into place that will help you understand and measure that the think time actually makes you much more effective. Resilient fundraisers go on to build resilient teams that then have the same mindset. And those resilient teams, bearing in mind for so many of our organizations how important fundraising is, they in effect build resilient organizations.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Fundraising Bright Spots podcast. This is episode 170. My name's Rob Woods, and this is the show for fundraisers who want ideas and perhaps a little dose of inspiration to help you raise more money and enjoy your job. This time, we're focusing on things you can do to improve your ability to handle the inevitable ups and downs of fundraising and of leadership. To help, I'm thrilled to be able to share my recent conversation with Jhumar Johnson. Jhumar is a very experienced development director, and for the last few years she's worked at the Open University as Chief of Staff to the Vice Chancellor. And just one role within this big, busy job is Development Director. On top of these responsibilities, Jhumar is also an executive coach, a public speaker, a mentor and a trainer, as well as sitting on the board of 2 foundations. Jhumar recently delivered the keynote for Bright Spots Breakfast Club for fundraising leaders, and her ideas about resilience, and in particular her habit of making time to just think, really struck a chord with our audience. We wanted to know more, so I was delighted that Jhumar was able to fit in this follow-up interview. I wanted to know more about why she finds thinking time so helpful, what it looks like in practice, and her tips for anyone who'd like to work more in this way. I see Jhumar as a resilient and very effective fundraising leader. It seems clear to me that the way she makes time to think, rather than mostly do stuff, is key to her results and her aura of calm confidence. I hope you enjoy her ideas as much as I did. Hi Jhumar, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Rob. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I've been very excited about this one because you did a talk for our Breakfast Club for Fundraising Leaders quite recently, and we got such an emphatic response to the whole topic actually, and in particular the idea of effective people make time to think quite deliberately, that I've been determined to create something for our podcast listeners as well. So before we get into the idea of time to think, I guess a first question is, you're a very busy person. As far as I can tell, it's a very large job for the Open University you have as Chief of Staff, which includes being a development director as well. And yet every time I've ever met you, I mean, we haven't met that frequently over the last 20 years, but every time I've met you, I have been taken aback by you. You've seemed relatively calm and positive every time. I've never heard you moan. I'm sure you have your moments like all of us, but I have always thought of you as a person who is relatively resilient. And on the talk the other day, you mentioned that you feel resilience is such an important thing, even more now. I guess my first question is, why do you think anyone who works for a charity or in fundraising right now needs to be aware of the importance of resilience?
I think the fact that the conversation we had over the breakfast session was so popular is probably a sign of the times, really. We live in incredibly turbulent times, and it's substantiated by a number of studies now about how turbulent times are. And I think in a fundraisers world, our work tests us daily. It's not current affairs that are impacting us any more than perhaps they might have in years gone by. There's targets to work with. There's repeated rejections. In fact, in preparing for this talk, I was thinking about what was my maximum. And I used to know this off the top of my head, but I think I've buried that memory now. It's 6 in one day. So 6 rejections in one day to my work, not to somebody in my team and not the wider team. So 6 is a lot, but I'm sure there will be others who will identify with that. So you have repeated rejections. You have a dependency within the organization on fundraised income and the pressure that that brings for individuals. And a number of our listeners, I'm sure, will be in that situation where they're sole fundraisers for their organizations. There are external factors that are out of our control. I just think that the nature of the job is such that it requires us to have a level of emotional and mental strength. And most of us develop it by doing the job that we do, because you just develop thick skin, I think, after a while. A lot of us have the advantage of going to training sessions like the ones that you've delivered, I've delivered, over how to deal with rejection and when is a no and not a no, and various other things that are coping mechanisms to make us survive, really. But I do think that increasingly this conversation, an open conversation about intentionally building resilience into our mindset and creating that kind of outlook is really, really important, because resilience isn't like an emergency response. It's more like meticulously laying the foundation, just like an engineer does when they're building a bridge. They know that the bridge has to weather storms, it has to weather heavy traffic. And as a result, they think from the beginning about the foundations of the bridge. Resilience is a little bit like that. So when you think about babies, they have natural resilience. They have to learn everything. They have no language. They have no skills to walk and to do things. And when you see how a baby learns how to walk, there's sort of repeated attempts and repeated failures, but they don't give up. They might cry, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, but they'll eventually figure out how to untangle those legs and how to not lie on a floor like an appended turtle. And they'll get walking. And somewhere along the line, we forget that we have this foundational resilience. And I love talking about this subject because some of this is about kind of reconnecting us to what we already know we have, because resilience is linked to who we are foundationally. So if we could do more of that and we could help unlock that in someone's thinking, even if it is by using tactics like think time, it would be fantastic.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned you have found helpful in staying resilient is quite deliberately planning to have more time thinking than maybe you used to and than maybe many people do. Why do you think that's such a helpful thing to do?
I think we live in a world where busyness is now associated with productivity. I don't know how many times, if you've noticed, you ask somebody, how are you? And now you get an answer, I'm busy. I don't know how that became an answer to how are you? I hear it from my coaching clients all the time as well, that they're incredibly busy, that their mind is full. I remember thinking myself not very long ago when I first started the role of the chief of staff, that very quickly between homeschooling, so I became chief of staff just at the 4 months before the pandemic hit, brand new person to be chief of staff too. I didn't really know him. I was also going to stay as director of development. So now I had these 2 jobs and 2 departments to think about. The pandemic hit, so we had to think about business transition, the welfare of our colleagues. And of course, there was homeschooling, and I had a 7-year-old at that time. And I am a horrendous teacher. He fired me, I think, about 4 times during that period and just went, you're better off as a mum, not as a teacher. But all of that, and I remember constantly sort of recognizing that I was telling myself quite loudly in my head that my brain was really full, that I needed rest, that I needed to switch off. And I really think that, coaching clients say this all the time too, that they find it really difficult to place value on quiet time, on think time, because it's the kind of culture that we live in, back-to-back meetings, I'm busy. It's almost as if that's become the sort of badge of honor. And I talk about think time as an intentional exercise because it does take some time to crack this think time business, because you have to give yourself permission to place value on think time. And if you're measures driven, put some sort of a system into place that will help you understand and measure that the think time actually makes you much more effective. I didn't really know about it when I first started the chief of staff job, but I became chief of staff to this incredible man who put think time as the first part of the briefing he gave us on how he wanted to work. And I was watching, whilst my brain was going, I need time to switch off and it's all so busy, I was watching this man. He never had back-to-back meetings. We always had prep time in his diary prior to any meeting. It didn't matter whether it was a simple one-to-one or it was a very difficult conversation with a minister. And he always had think time in his diary. It was like 20% of your week is just because as the Vice Chancellor of an organization, yes, you're making lots of reactive decisions, but you're also making lots of long-term decisions. Some of the decisions you make today have a very long tail. And the respect he would give to these decisions. So I kind of thought, well, look, he's a clever man. He's frightfully bright. I really enjoy working with him. I respect him a lot. And if this works for him, why don't I try it? And that's how I fell into it, really. And over the years, I've found a way such that it is now a habit and a discipline for me.
There was one part of the talk you gave the other day where you put a slide up and you asked us to find something, and I couldn't see it. And then I noticed in the chat quite a lot of people could. And after it, I was so glad you did that, because it was really an exercise in pausing and seeing what's really there, not just what you think you're looking for or what you think is the answer to the question. And it was such an interesting metaphor to me, because as you describe your colleague, and as I picture you being as effective as I know you to be, and other people I really admire, I think one of the things they do is they spot the opportunities and or the important challenges, and therefore when they get to the seemingly main stage or the meeting, the interview, the pitch, they're doing the right things, or they've solved the problem because they spotted what was there. And in times when I'm less effective, it's like when I was staring at that slide and I was answering the wrong question.
To be fair, it's the hidden tiger slide. So those that know it will understand it. Those that not, I don't think we've given anything away. But resilience is so much about perspective. It's how do you take the negative, turn it into the positive? How do you think sideways? It really requires you to kind of shift the way you think about things, and make it much more about permission to fail, permission to learn, and the ability to be optimistic. So Harvard Business Review actually lists 3 characteristics of resilient people. And it's really interesting what they put in there. One of the things is that resilient people have a very staunch acceptance of reality. The second thing is that they have a very, very deep belief. And often you'll see values alignment as well in that belief, that life is meaningful. And the third is that they have an uncanny ability to improvise. So this is very much the glass half full kind of person that you come across. And I am definitely, I think I have a reputation, but I am most certainly one of those irritatingly optimistic people in life. You could give me anything, and my first response will be, I'm sure we can find a way. I'm sure we can fix it. I'm definitely the fixer mentality. There is some good and bad to that, but I'm definitely the fixer mentality. And I really think that resilience really is about being able to turn that perspective. So something's happened. We've got to know, how do we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and what is the lesson that we learn and move forward?
That's so interesting, Jhumar. I think I read somewhere once that inside any disappointment, there's the seed of a potential much bigger advantage, but only if we choose to look for it. And I know that when I'm disappointed, I can find that really quite hard to do, because it does sting so much, and the current bad result really feels like everything. But there are times when I've realized, no, actually, in hindsight, that was true, because I learned it was much more valuable to me. I don't know if that's happened to you.
I'm a fundraiser, Rob. There must be so many examples. There is one that comes to mind because it really did, in many ways, influence a large part of my practice going forward. But by practice, I mean it made me braver about being honest. And that happened because I won't drop any names, but I went to effectively early on in my career, pick up a check. So all the work had been done by somebody else. I was a new fundraiser, and I was just walking into the situation to literally go and pick up the check. But this donor was going to become my donor. It was my relationship to build. And the one thing I'd been told was that he was a really big football fan of a particular team that is very well known. I really don't have a clue about football, but I kind of got it in my head that that was the team, et cetera, et cetera. And so we got there, started chatting, and his football team, in my head, had won that weekend. So I decided to say to him, you must be so pleased that your football team won. Well, his football team was playing the hated opponents, and they lost. And because I'd got the two football teams mixed up in my head, that little mistake cost me, and no judgment to the individual because I've known him for years now, but he taught me a very valuable lesson. It cost me the check that day. It was a 6-figure check. The fundraiser prior to me had done all of the work. I was going to pick the check up, and he showed me the check and didn't give it to me. And he said that I would have to work for it again because I had made a mistake. And I left the room kind of thinking, but these are career ending moments. You sort of think, you've just lost your organization a lot of money because you got a football team mixed up. But my boss was amazing. The donor has a particular reputation as well. He's difficult and very disciplined about certain things. So I didn't get fired, thank God. But in the aftermath, I remember thinking, why did I pretend to know something I don't know anything about? And really, if we are building relationships in fundraising, why are we building relationships on the basis of make-believe or pretend? I don't know anything about football. I could just say I don't know anything about football. And not only that, why did I have to bring it up as a conversation opener? It could have been anything else. And that really made me stop, think, work very hard to get that money back. And we did. We got it back in a few months. But it taught me forever to be very honest about what I know and what I don't know, whether that is about my organization, whether it might be about the product that I'm talking about, the cause that I'm presenting. And at all times say to somebody, I don't know, but I'll find out. And that has sort of become my go-to. And as a result, I don't mind walking blind into pitch meetings without knowing everything about the individual, without having in my mind what I need to sell to them. I'm very happy to genuinely enter a conversation that is a give and take between them and me, build a relationship, and very often end up saying, actually, I don't know the answer to the question that you've just asked me, but I'm going to go and find out. So it was a failure at that moment, but it was probably the turning point and the reason for so many successes thereafter.
It's such a good example. And I know that when I am stung by something going wrong, in that moment, it can be hard for me or someone with me to try and help me see that. And that's okay. It's just after you've settled down and if you need to feel the frustration, search for the upside, and sometimes a much bigger upside than the downside you think you just experienced.
You're absolutely right. It really is how quickly can you turn it into a learning experience and into something that can be fixed. Things happen. You feel them, you wallow in them, you sit with them. And then it's about changing your perspective and thinking about, so what do you do next? What did you learn? What do you do next? How do you fix it? How do you move forward? And resilient fundraisers go on to build resilient teams that then have the same mindset. And those resilient teams, bearing in mind for so many of our organizations how important fundraising is, they in effect build resilient organizations. As a result, you don't see short-term decisions being made. My boss could have fired me that day, but she didn't. She understood what had happened and she taught me. Similarly, a few rejections shouldn't mean that somebody up top is questioning your fundraising strategy and you're thinking you need to rewrite it. It should simply be about assessing whether the strategy is right, whether you need to stay the course or whether there is some course correction to do, but not being influenced by the panic somebody else shows, being confident enough. And I really do think that fundraisers on the whole have a lot of natural resilience. It's built, I think, the hard way. We don't know it, but it's there. And I've worked with so many over the years, both within my teams, through mentoring, through coaching, where you realize that it's a sort of thread that runs through their basic functioning that they fall back on constantly. It's just the discipline, I think, of building it with intention as opposed to by accident. And that's really part of the conversation we were having at the breakfast event was, in an environment that is so fraught and an external world that just feels constantly turbulent, what can we do intentionally to give our brains that kind of downtime, the thinking time it requires? There's a lot of research that will now substantiate the fact that your brain needs downtime to do some of its best work. So what can we do in our day-to-day roles that gives us that space?
I think something I've been realizing in the last couple of months, Jhumar, is if I do make time proactively to think, quite often I realize of all the things I could be doing today or this week, this one is the most important and it must not get lost. And when I'm not making time to think, often that clarity does not come. I wonder if you could talk to that point of helping one choose the right things to give most attention to.
I certainly think as a chief of staff, my entire tenure has been defined by the word crisis. So chief of staff, 4 months later, pandemic, and we don't seem to have come out of that kind of crisis response, really. It's very easy, I think, to get lost in the doing of things. And we all know where we procrastinate. We all know how many emails we answer because we don't want to be sitting and writing that bid. We all know that you can get to the end of the day and sit there and think, what actually did I do today? Because that really important thing that I really didn't want to do is still sitting there on the table. I remember there is a gentleman called Tony Schwartz, and he's a journalist and a CEO of the Energy Project. And I remember reading some of his stuff before, which is really about thinking about downtime and how we change our perspective to it. But one of the things that he talks about is about taking on, giving your brain the rest it requires, getting good sleep, all of those sorts of things. And we can come to that when we discuss some practicalities. But one of the things he had said was that you tackle the most challenging task on your to-do list first thing in the morning so that you give it your full attention. And maybe it came at the right time, maybe it was what I was dealing with, but it just sort of made me think most of the things I put off are the things that are tough, that require me to think through, that I can't wing, that I can't just do by instinct. And I changed the way I started doing things. So my first hour in the morning is generally not full of meetings if I can avoid it. And my first hour in the morning, at least once a week at the beginning of the week, if not every day in the week, is about what is the toughest thing I need to be thinking about or dealing with. And I will deal with that first. It could be tough because it's about writing something I don't want to write. It could be a decision that I need to make. It could be the crisis that we're working on, the alignment that is required as a result. But it's the first thing. And I've practiced that now for 3-4 years. I'm not perfect at it. There are lots of times where even I look at things and kind of go, I really can't be asked. It's a Monday morning and I don't want to do this. I'm going to leave it. But I think I've become used to doing it now to the point that if I find myself thinking like that, it only makes me double down. So I'm kinder to myself by saying, okay, take a 10-minute break. You've only just begun, but take a 10-minute break. Go away, make a cup of tea, do something nice, but you're not going to do it. It will happen first thing in the morning. You've just given yourself some grace and a shift, I think, in your perspective by going away and staring at the flowers for a little while.
I've been doing my best to do this for a long time as well. I have my days when I fail at it, but definitely when I'm at my best, I'm doing the same thing. If our listeners really like the idea, then a book I really recommend is called Eat That Frog. And it's all about this. The only distinction I would make for what I strive to do in my understanding of it is very often the thing I was going to put off is challenging and hard, but I try to ask myself the question, what is the most important thing? And whilst often it's challenging, just occasionally there are some really valuable things which actually were a 2-minute thing, or they were surprisingly easy. It's just, had I not asked that question, they weren't on my to-do list, or they weren't near the top of what others were demanding of me. So it is also true that quite often important things are also challenging, but I just want to add that extra distinction for our listeners to realize sometimes you get the most valuable thing of your whole day or even your whole week done, and it actually was much easier than you thought.
Yes. And I think the discipline of thinking time really helps you hone in on, what is the North Star for you at all times. And therefore, no matter what is going on around you, the one thing that is really important is X. And we will all be able to define it for ourselves if we just thought about the most important thing to us in getting the job done. In my case, sometimes it is keeping my son alive. So I know between 5 and 6:30, nothing can get in the way of the fact that I have to cook and feed him because nobody else is going to in my house. And it's amazing how you get clarity as a result of just some things that you kind of go are unmovable. I've identified this is unmovable and it's important or it's critical. And sometimes it changes. Sometimes it is a constant for a year. Sometimes it is every week there is a different constant. But this is where the kind of reflection time you give yourself helps to identify what are the most critical things that have to be done. And as a result, what needs to shift, move, be done differently.
So, Jhumar, if our listeners are thinking, yes, I've always known I really could be trying to make a little bit more time to think, but I've struggled so far, could you give us a sense of, I mean, you've already done it a little, but give us a sense of what it looks like for you that you have found works, and any other tips that people might consider?
So I make a distinction between prep time and what I call big time. So big is brain in gear time. That's my thinking time. And as a result, and also the discipline of trying not to have back-to-back meetings. It's the norm. It happens. It still happens in my diary. But part of my shifting my thinking about back-to-back meetings was really that I was being disrespectful to the people I was showing up in front of in these back-to-back meetings, because they don't really give you a time to kind of recalibrate and think about who you're going to be in the room with. Certainly, my colleague who looks after my diary knows that if I have donor meetings, if I have meetings that are difficult conversations, for example, there's always 30 minutes in my diary sacrosanct so that I have time to recalibrate my brain from the rest of the day and think about what I'm about to walk into and get my brain into kind of gear. That's the prep time. The brain in gear time, in a sense, is the thinking time. And sometimes, some weeks, that thinking time is going for a walk. Sometimes it is literally doing nothing for 30 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever it is that I need at that time. But as a discipline, I factor in thinking time at least twice a week. And that is time that is not given to anybody. It's in my working hours. It's in my working day. And it may well be that I've got a list of things that I add into my diary that are, must think about these. That's in the thinking time. But typically every week, at least once a week, there is nothing against that thinking time. And it is time just for me to give my brain some quiet time. I know that in the back of my mind, there are lots of things and it's going to do its thing, but I respect that it needs downtime for doing some of those things. And I have to say, over the years, I know that I have done some of my best thinking in those moments where I'm not thinking about anything. And very often, certainly I do puzzles. My only way of switching off is to go into a puzzle, because it just really makes my brain focus on one thing whilst it's doing another thing. And inevitably I will come back and I'll have an answer to something I know I need to be thinking about, or there'll be some prompts in my brain. So I definitely clocked it. But because I was starting to do it intentionally, when I saw how Tim did it and I was starting to do it intentionally, I also thought about how I measure my effectiveness. Really, does this work for myself? And it's a simple exercise. I'm a coach, so of course I would use a scale. But for me, it was just a simple, when I've been doing thinking time and when I haven't been doing thinking time, it's a scale of 1 to 10. Do I think I was better in that meeting because I had stopped to prep? Or was I just good? Because I can wing it. I'm a fundraiser. I can wing it. You can throw me into most situations and I'll come up with something. But is it my best work? And I have to say, almost always the answer has been, I've been better because I stopped and gave myself time to prep, gave myself time to think about the long tail of some of the decisions that I might be making with my team. It's almost always better. So I fully believe that time blocking in your diary and within your working hours, this is not I go for a walk in the evening and that's when I do all my thinking related to work. No, this is about respecting that thinking time is just as valuable as the meetings that you do. Putting that into your diary, making sure that it does not move, just like you wouldn't move a donor meeting out of your diary. Donor meetings come first in my diary. Yes, external meetings, even today. But thinking time has just the same amount of respect given to it and it doesn't move. So you can try these simple things and see if it works for you. There are lots of things that people do. I'm sure if we opened it up to suggestions, people would have much better suggestions than the ones that have worked for me. But having done them now for nearly 5 years, they definitely do work. Just try time boxing it in and respecting that your working day should have your time built in. And see what happens.
Wonderful advice, Jhumar. We need to get you away very soon. But if there's someone out there and they see the sense of this, but they're still on the edge as to whether to do this because there's so much to do today, any last tip or idea that you'd love to share with them that might just give them some encouragement?
I think one of the best things you can try is have an accountability partner of some sort. So a while ago, a colleague and I realized that because we have weekly check-ins, we didn't really need to be on a screen talking to each other. We know each other. We've known each other for a long time. And we're doing weekly check-ins and having the conversation about things that need to get done. So we both started using that time as our walking time. And she just sort of went, well, look, I really need to go walking more too. So why don't we use our once a week 45-minute stand up check in as our walking time? And that's what we did. So the accountability partner can be a really interesting exercise. If you, your colleague, or you and your partner at home, or anyone, or your friend is thinking about this together, you could do it. Or you could just simply say to somebody, look, I really want to make this change. It could be your PA if you have one. Can you help me do this? Just keep me true to it. And if I find myself faltering, you'll be the person who will tell me to not do that. And you asked for one, but I'm going to give you two. The best downtime for our brains to help us think better, be better, is sleep. If you can't do anything, just focus on your sleep and get good sleep. And that will make a huge difference to how you turn up and how your resilience turns up.
Wonderful tips, Jhumar. I need to get things finished. Thank you ever so much, on top of your very busy and demanding job, to share these ideas to help our listeners. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to catching up with you another time for the podcast. But for now, thank you ever so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
There you go. I hope you found our chat helpful. As we always do, we'll put a summary in the episode notes on the podcast section of our Brightspot website. If you've not already subscribed to our show, please do click that button now. You'll get instant access through your phone to dozens more examples and tips to help you with your fundraising. As I record this, I am super excited about some fabulous new Brightspot stories I'm going to be sharing in the next few weeks. So please don't miss out on the chance to receive those straight to your phone when we release them. Remember, if you find this podcast, my books, my webinars, or our Breakfast Club helpful, just think how much more difference it would make if we could go into any of these techniques at a deeper level and with the rest of your team. If you sense this would be valuable, then do get in touch to start a conversation. One of our favourite things to do is to create a bespoke training day to help your team learn powerful techniques and grow fundraising results. To find out more or to request a chat, go to brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. Thank you as always for supporting our show, either by listening or indeed by sharing it with your friends, your team, or on LinkedIn. You can't know just how big a difference this generous sharing makes to me when I'm up against it, trying somehow to carve out some precious time to create a new episode. Thank you as always for the part you play in this show existing. Do let us know what you think. Jhumar and I are both easy to find on LinkedIn. Good luck with your fundraising and with your efforts to deliberately make time to think this week. And I can't wait to share another Brightspot story with you very soon.